I'm Dr. Richard Winters, and in my years spent at Mayo Clinic as an emergency physician, executive coach, and director of leadership development, I've learned that the person you want calling the shots, whether that's in the emergency department or in the boardroom, is a person who knows how to make reasoned decisions in complex environments. They develop an organization that responds effectively to emerging challenges and threats. And they do this while reducing burnout and boosting the satisfaction of colleagues. Are you ready? You're the leader. Now what?
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Leading with Gratitude Live. I'm your host, Jess Rell, and that's my wonderful guest, Dr. Richard Winters. We're delighted to have you here, Doctor. And before we jump into the conversation, I want to give a little bit of your bio, but welcome everybody to our show. You know, we love our gratitude community. We love that you're tuning in from all over the world on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. And, you know, we always say, look, give us 30 minutes of your time. We'll give you a recipe for a life of gratitude at work, at home, and in your communities. We're delighted to be with you here today. Well, a little bit more about Dr. Winters, my new good friend, Richard. He's an emergency physician at the Mayo Clinic, director of leadership development at the Mayo Clinic Care Network. Dr. Winters delivers programs that train leaders at all levels of healthcare and organizations worldwide. He is also an executive coach, and we're going to dig into that a little bit. He provides coaching for all kinds of Mayo Clinic leaders. Now, Dr. Winters graduated from the Mayo Clinic Alex School of Medicine in 1994, returned to the Mayo Clinic in 2015. Previously, he served as a managing partner of a Democratic physician group, department chair of an emergency department, president of an 800 physician medical staff. I'm sure that was a lot of fun.
Yes.
And CEO and founder of a startup managed care organization that struggled to survive amidst the complex relationships among hospital, physician, patient, competitors, and insurance providers. Foremost, and I want you to remember this, and I want you to go on Amazon and buy it. He is the author of You're the Leader Now. You're the Leader. Now what? Leadership Lessons from the Mayo Clinic. It came out in September of this year. Richard, delighted to have you on the show. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Chester. Thank you for having me.
Good. Now, this is your first book. And we were talking before the show. Your first book is the coolest, right? Because your name is on it. You're in bookstores. You're taking it from the bottom shelf and putting it over top of all the bestsellers on the rack. Tell me why you decided to write the book. Give me a little backstory and why you felt so compelled that you needed to write this book.
Yeah, so I deliver these programs to leaders, and also in the coaching, I find that leaders are facing these situations where they've been doing this job really well, and then all of a sudden they become the leader, and now they're in this position where they're having to solve these really complex issues, and their friends are all disagreeing, and everyone's kind of looking to them. And oftentimes during these discussions, the question is, now what? What do I do? And for myself, I experienced that on almost a daily basis. And so I wanted to write a book that a leader could pick up and open a chapter and find some tactics and some approaches that they can use to deal with these really thorny situations, whether that's one-to-one or with groups of colleagues.
Yeah, isn't it interesting, whether you're coaching or you're speaking, you can have that bump. If you've got the book to leave behind, that's the roadmap, right? That's the textbook. And they can always go back to that, because how much are they going to remember? Right. So good for you.
And the nice thing is, as you write, you're thinking in words, and you're like, do I really think that? And there must be more to this. And you can start to extend stuff. I found it to be a very helpful process.
Excellent. I as we were talking earlier, I grew up in Canada, so I love that we've got Tushar tuning in from Halifax, Canada. Beautiful part of Canada, by the way. Craig Dowden, our friend from Toronto, and we've got people from Zimbabwe and all over the place, which is great fun. Hey, based on your experiences and lessons from the Mayo Clinic, one of the most famous hospitals on the planet. Your framework helps leaders navigate decisions and challenges, is the way you put it, and to reduce employee burnout. You were saying you're the guy that grabs everybody and says, look, particularly because you're in the emergency room, right? Here's how you avoid burnout. So tell us about how you go about that. First off, how can you sense people are burning out? And what are sort of the first things you do to triage that, to use an emergency room?
Yeah.
Word there.
So I think there's a couple things to think about. So one is, what is burnout? That's when you become emotionally exhausted, and we all have these days where we're emotionally exhausted. That isn't alone burnout. The second thing is, on top of that, you start becoming cynical. And so I think about the emergency physician who's like, oh, great, another ambulance. And you're thinking like, well, this is actually kind of what you do. Ambulances come in, you take care of patients. And if someone starts getting cynical about their job and they're emotionally exhausted, then the third thing is that you become less effective. And so that's what burnout is. And it's not a terminal diagnosis. I mean, I think most of us have gone through it. And in fact, 10 years ago, I would ask how many of you had experienced burnout, and few people raise their hands. Now almost everyone does. It's because we have the words and the language to start to describe it. And so, yeah, so that burnout on one hand, and then on the other hand is well-being. And I think of those two things as going in hand. I think one of the issues that we face, like you go online, if you go on LinkedIn or Twitter and you hear about burnout, a lot of times people are talking about it from the perspective of being a victim, which can be difficult. And also leaders can talk about it from the perspective of being other individuals' problems. And I like to think of it as there's three different levels I think about. So from an organizational perspective, is the organization think that burnout is important to be watching? So as an emergency physician, I measure vital signs. I'm not going to take care of a patient without knowing their vital signs. As a leader, one of the vital signs, in addition to your revenue, your costs, and quality, is burnout. Because if you're running an organization where people are burned out, it's going to affect your costs, it's going to affect your quality, and certainly it's going to affect the lives. And so, is the board on board? Are the leaders on board? And so to say this is important. I think the big thing from a leader perspective is kind of the second level, which is how we're interacting and how we're coming together around these really complex, thorny issues that we deal with on a daily basis. And so, how are we running meetings? How are we having one-to-one colleagues with colleagues? How are we looking at these like really thorny issues and deciding how to move forward? And so there's things that we can do to affect that. And then finally, the final kind of layer is individually, because there are individual things. I know that if I have not slept, if I've been up, all night and I haven't eaten well, I haven't exercised, I'm pretty crusty. And I'm more likely, in a series of days to get burned out because of that. And so there are things that I can do there. But then there's like ways that I'm making sense of my own situation, and whether I'm feeling trapped, and whether I'm feeling like I'm a victim, or whether I'm finding these areas where I have efficacy and can find things to affect and kind of change my environment. And so those three levels, I think it's important because it's a system. It's all kind of enmeshed with each other.
Yeah. For those of you who are tuning in, and by the way, we've got Joe from Leicester, England. My son's a huge Premiership fan and is delighted that your team is out of the drop, as they say in the Premiership. From those of you that are listening, tune in. Are you suffering from burnout in the workplace? And as our friend, the doctor, says, does your organization care? Like, do you feel like your organization cares about you burning out? I'd love to get some comments in there. And by the way, Christy Lawrence is manning our question command center. So she'll curate all your questions and flash them up on the screen. But I'm always curious, how are you feeling at work? Are you feeling burned out? And as the good doctor says, do you think your organization actually cares whether you're burning out or not? You've got three things you talk about in your book, three keys where you say you've got to create a shared reality. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, about, what's realistic, identifying fears and worries, and then infusing a shared vision. So why don't you go ahead and that creating a shared reality? Why is that so important?
So I think for all of us, we can enter a meeting and hear something, some problem that we're going to be discussing, and then almost like in an instant, like we know what should be done. This is just part of being human, right? And so as I wake up in the morning, I decide whether I'm going to turn off the alarm or get up. I decide what I'm going to wear. I don't get hit by the bus as I'm walking across the street. As I enter the room, those same sorts of reflexes arise with any of the most difficult challenges. And as people are talking, I'm thinking, no, they're wrong. They're right. I agree with them. And so oftentimes we're running meetings in that sort of way, and we're dealing about these really, really complex issues. And so how do we turn that off? And what is more frustrating than sitting in a meeting, like you're in the meeting and then the leader says something, someone else says something, and then they move on like they've solved this, and you feel like you've had no input. You're like, what about me? Or even worse, you say something and you feel like you haven't been heard. And it's because you haven't been heard, like you haven't been listened to. And so what oftentimes happens during these meetings is we jump to kind of the way forward, what we're going to do. And so I call that like rowing backwards, and I think we should be rowing forward. And so when we're rowing forward, what we're doing first is we're understanding that this is a really complex issue, and we need to be developing shared reality. And so what does that mean? It means that like you have your ideas of what should occur and your experience and what might be ways forward, but it's behind your own kind of blind spots. And so each of us has our blind spots. And so why don't we pull together various different perspectives, which includes agreements, it includes disagreements, it includes different perspectives. And so at Mayo Clinic, I'm a physician, and a nurse is going to have a very different perspective. The administrator is going to have a very different perspective. But as we start to create this sort of shared reality, we may have more insight before we decide what the options are, which is the O in row forward, and then W, the way forward.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting, Christy. If you want to put Tushar's kind of a comment up there about, he said, it's difficult identifying the burnout with the team, and at times with a few individuals. We see this all the time as someone who's really ambitious and wants to take on more than they can handle, right? And I loved his comment at the end. While for others it could be a competency gap. You've got. I always look at audiences that we present to and say, "Hey, how many of you have somebody that's just killing it every day, right?" And they all raise their hands. I said, "And what do you do with those guys?" Say, "Yeah, we load them up. We more and more and more."
Here you go.
And they never say no, right? Because they always deliver. And so I think your point about shared reality is there are times when you want to step back and say, "Hey, Richard, you're taking on way too much here." Like,
Yeah.
I get that you want to be involved in everything. No one can be involved in everything. So are you seeing that in an emergency room as well? Rather than the eye rolling, here's another ambulance where they go, whoa,
Yeah.
ambulance, let's run out and get that guy.
I'd love to like transition from talking about burnout and transition to starting about things like autonomy, things about personal growth, talking about alignment with values, talking about recovery, talking about, I mean, these are the things that when we're not paying attention to those elements of well-being, that burnout starts to creep in. And so when you have the individual has so much on their plate, are they having time to recover? Are they having time for their own personal growth? Are they feeling like they're doing your things, or are they feeling a sense of autonomy, like they're being heard and have some way of kind of making the dent in the situation in the way that they want to? I like that, like looking forward to what we're wanting as opposed to, trying to think about the disease that we're experiencing.
That's a great perspective. Hey, tell us real quick, people are going to want to know more about your book and your work. Where should we send them to find out more about you?
Yeah. Thank you. So it's very creatively named richardwinters.com. I was trying to think of like what. So my name, richardwinters.com. And the book's available on any of the bookstores. It's on hardcover, audiobook, and then also Kindle. So.
And you read your own book, which is good for you.
I do.
I love it when you tune in and you've maybe heard the TED Talk or something, and then you pull up the audiobook and it's some actor and you kind of go, come on. So
I wanted to read it as Darth Vader, but they wouldn't let me. So.
It was so funny. Adrian and I said, "Can we do this one in an Irish accent?" He goes, "No, we can't." Hey, so you talk about identifying fears and worries, which is a little bit about what you just talked about, sort of what's missing.
Yeah.
Where do you want to go? Do you want to take a little deeper dive on that, on identifying fears and worries? And, I'm a big fan of the rule of three. I love that you had create a shared reality, identifying fears and worries, infusing a shared. I can remember three things, right?
Yeah.
So clearly this was really important, and you put it in at number 2. So tell us a little more about why that's so important.
Yeah. So as we're moving forward with these challenges, there are fears and worries that we have about what might happen. And it's quite common for me to go into an organization and the leader's like, whatever you do, don't bring this thing up. And for me, I'm like, all right, I know what I'm going to bring up. That's
right.
the key thing. And so there's these fears and these worries that kind of live in the darkness. And if we don't shine a light on them, then they will come up, they will surface, and then they'll impede strategy. And so, how wonderful it is to ask, so what are the fears and the worries that you have? And oftentimes the fears and worries, ironically, they're in line with elements of well-being that might be lost. The fear that I'm not going to be heard or feel unsafe to speak, the fear that this is not in alignment with our values, the fear that this is going to destroy a sense of teamwork, all of these sorts of things. If we're not bringing these things forward before we start to think about the options for what we might do, it's just not going to work so well. And as you bring up these fears and worries, then these are things that we want to mitigate. We want to decrease the chance of them from happening. And as we then transition to vision, we can include that in our vision. We want to do this in a way that doesn't hinder our ability to work together as a team. We want to do this in a way, in a manner that invokes our values, our shared values. And so if the monsters hide in the darkness, not good. And I think for leaders, that can be something that's kind of difficult. They're worried about, if I bring this up, maybe this kind of the fears and worries envelop. It's actually the opposite. We just need to call these things out and face them.
Yeah, I really appreciate the way you position that from the leader's perspective, because you say, "Hey, I've got this fear and this worry, and I don't want to find out that I'm right."
Right.
I'd,
Yeah.
I'd rather be blissfully ignorant and think that maybe it's not as bad as I thought. If I ask them and they tell me, I go, "Dang, it is true." We're in deep pockets here.
And let me just say, and one thing that's often happens is the fear of change is there. But now let's talk about what would be the fear or worries of doing nothing,
Right.
of the status quo. And so we can get trapped by talking about all the fears about what might happen if we move forward. But what oftentimes is even worse is if we just stay complacent and let the world kind of revolve around us. And so it's important to bring that up too.
Yeah. And the idea of infusing shared vision. I mean, to me, the emotional attachment to work is always so important. And if your values are aligned and your visions are aligned with your organization, you're much more likely to really, dig in when times are hard and press forward when times are difficult. That would be my interpretation of infusing a shared vision. Is that kind of yours? Am I on track, or do you have a different take on that?
So I think you're establishing this shared reality where you're gathering all these perspectives, agreements, disagreements, and those sorts of things about some challenge. And then when you start to move to visioning, the question is, do we still want to move forward with this challenge? And if the answer is yes, that's great. We're all on board. Sometimes, let's not. This is too much time. So that's the first part of vision, is deciding that you're going to move forward on this challenge. I think there are other things that we can do. And so oftentimes we're in organizations, and the reason I'm at Mayo Clinic is because it's aligned with values. The values speak to me. The caring for the needs of patients, and the respect, integrity, all those sorts of things. We can infuse that into the vision. So we're going to move forward in this challenge in ways that reflect our values. And so that's kind of step 2 for the visioning phase. And then step 3 for the visioning phase. And we're going to do so in a way that mitigates these fears and worries. And so now we have this really strong statement about how we're going to move forward in a way reflected by our values. And that is going to decrease the chance of these fears and worries from occurring.
Excellent. So obviously our show is called Leading with Gratitude Live. How important is creating a culture of gratitude where you see people doing this really important work and they feel some kind of affirmation? Have you found that, especially in an emergency room or throughout the Mayo Clinic, that's an important element of, creating that culture where people kind of feel safe, feel valued?
Yeah. I mean, so I'm in Rochester, Minnesota. And the Mayo Clinic was formed in late 1800s after a tornado went through town. And so Will and Charlie Mayo, the brothers, they partnered with the sisters, and they built the hospital, and they created this system. And so there are stories that start from that point on. And that those stories reflect a gratitude for what these individuals have done. And then on a day-by-day basis, I read stories within our organization about the ways that we've met the needs of patients, the ways that we've helped individuals, the ways that someone has stepped up and really gone above and beyond. And these things are inspiring. And so this kind of gratitude for who we are collectively, and then also individually, what we bring to the organization and to each other, it's very valuable.
It's interesting. I've taken a tour of the Mayo Clinic, and I mentioned that the best man at my wedding works at the Mayo Clinic and has for a long time now. And that culture of storytelling and where we came from and our roots, and that it's still really vibrant. I mean, even the library, when you go in and you see all that stuff, is really a part of the everyday experience at Mayo Clinic, whether you're a patient or a doctor, isn't it?
Yeah, so true. I mean, it's infused in there, and it's what brings us together. It really is.
Yeah. So great question from Melissa. Melissa Anderson, thank you for your question, Melissa. Talks about, how do you shift from that victim mentality, like the woe is me? How do you then bring people out from being the victim and take control of that and move forward? Any tips on that? Melissa?
Yeah, so I think first of all, let's just acknowledge that there are systemic reasons, things that can kind of push us towards burnout. There are our interactions with colleagues that can push us toward. If we're interacting with individuals not being heard, they're being mean to us, those sorts of things. These are things that can push us towards burnout. But now let's concentrate on the things that we can do. And from a coaching perspective, one of my favorite statements is, given that, how would you like to move forward? And so just that statement of how would you like to move forward, you're not trapped. Let's acknowledge this, that you're not trapped. Some people are in very difficult situations, but even in those most difficult situations, what are the things that you can do to affect change that's going to help move you towards well-being? And so I think that is it. It's really, on the one hand, acknowledging the external stuff, but really internally owning the fact that you have efficacy, and let's try to find this. What are the things that you can do? And what are the ways that you can boost your autonomy? What are the ways that you can increase your interactions with others, that you can align with a sense of values? And in some cases, so I have a garden, and there are some plants that don't grow well in that part of my property. And so you kind of just pull those weeds, and then you try to grow something somewhere else. And I like to think of us in being the same way. Sometimes we're in organizations, we're in departments, we're working with colleagues where we're not able to thrive, but we have legs. And so let's move to a different garden, right, where we can grow, and let's figure out how to do that. And that doesn't come from looking at it from a victim kind of perspective. It comes from looking at it from a perspective of efficacy.
That is such a positive way to approach it, right? What can you control? And hey, let's get you to where you can grow. Wonderful comment from Anita, and I'm going to butcher your last name here, Jaya Kumar, that she is actually a Mayo trained coach. And just a little shout out to their Dr. Winters, coaching and mentoring, such an important part of the culture, ensuring that great.
I knew I liked Anita.
Yeah.
Hi, Anita.
Yeah, let's grab another question here. How to deal with colleagues who are suddenly challenged by your performance and may not be supportive as it starts to make them look bad. That teamwork environment. Hey, don't work 80 hours a week, then we'll all be expected to work 80 hours a week, right? Even more, how do you back? Wait a minute, put that back up. Even more, how do you back the team spirit if one's good performance is showing others' weaknesses? I think we've got a high performer here. How would you coach him up?
Yeah, I mean, I think let's just talk about what a leader is, and that's how I like to approach it in the book. And I think of leaders as being individuals who develop other leaders, not followers. And a leader does not need a specific, like, a formal role, and they can be informal. And so there are those individuals that we go to who they can help us out, and whether they have a formal or informal role, that's helpful. I want to work in a team where it's not individual genius, but collective genius, where collective wisdom is encouraged. And I think it's Brian Eno who talks about collective genius as being something called genius. And so, right, this is Brian Eno is an individual who produced like U2 and like all these best albums, and they have these groups that come in with very powerful personalities, and each of them has their distinct kind of expertise in areas where they really shine. But the ability to bring individuals together, each who shine in their own way, I think is what's important. At Mayo Clinic, we have three shields. We have education, we have research, and we have clinical practice. Some of our colleagues excel in education, not so much in research. Some of them excel in research and not so much in education. But we know it takes all of us put together to create this really strong organization. And so I think we want to be working with leaders and with individuals where we're recognizing what each of us has to bring to the organization and to each other.
It's so interesting you bring in those different roles, because I was listening to a podcast the other day, and the guy says, in every story, there's a victim, a villain, a hero, and the mentor, right? And or the guide. He calls it the guide. And he said, and we're all of those all the time. So we can find ourselves in a situation where we find ourselves being the victim. There are times when, as leaders, we're the villain, right? Yeah. And then there are times where we want to be the hero, and then executive coaches are always the guides, right? And I think it's really interesting the way you're describing your garden and the way you coach people up and looking forward. You can play all of those roles at some point. Where do you want to be? A couple of great questions, and we're not going to get to all of them, by the way. We're in the last five minutes here. We will go on later and answer your questions online, and Dr. Winters has agreed to do that. I do like Joey Hamilton, or Joey Heimfarb. Hamilton. I'm sorry about that, Joey. Um, what were the challenges in writing your book, and how did you handle them? And then I always like to ask, do you have a favorite part of the book? Like, is there one chapter that is your favorite?
Those are great questions. And so how did I write the book is I created talks. And so I would give talks, and each of those talks ended up being a chapter. And the nice thing about that is, as I was giving these talks, these programs, and the idea behind these programs is that I'm helping individuals. They bring these challenges and that they're able to work through them. I was able to see what was working and what was not working. And so the challenge was identifying the things that resonated the best, that were the most helpful, the best metaphors. And actually the writing process helped even clarify that more. And so I think it's the most challenging thing, was also the most rewarding thing, was this constant writing, seeing what I've written, and then editing it, finding better ways of saying it, throwing out those things that maybe I loved the way they sounded, but weren't so helpful to others. I think my favorite part of the book, I mean, maybe the thing that you write in the front, I'm not even sure. It's called basically, this is for leaders. I mean, for you, a leader. I mean, it's really, that's my favorite part, is writing this book, hoping that I'm helping someone who is facing challenges, and trying to figure out how to best help others. And so that's my favorite part, is hoping that the book, someone can open up chapter 10 and find something that resonates with things that they need to take care of right now.
That's great. And isn't it wonderful when you get a note from somebody on LinkedIn say, "Hey, I read your book. It solved a problem for me."
Yeah.
And that validation is beyond wonderful, isn't it?
So
Tell
true.
tell us again your website and where we can find the book.
Yeah. So richardwinters.com is my website. And then the book, You're the Leader, Now What, is available at any of the bookstores, in audiobook, hardcover, and also audiobook.
Excellent, excellent. Hey, I always love to ask my guests, what are you grateful for today? We have all these gratitude practices, and I'm just curious. And you can't say the podcast; that's too easy, or the live show we're doing here. So, what is one thing that you're grateful for today?
Well, I mean, I think I'm not going to say the podcast, but I am grateful for individuals coming together and trying to identify ways that they can be more effective and have more efficacy and help each other out. That's what I love. I love interacting with individuals at work and identifying people who are able to just really connect with others, and then I'm able to learn from that, and then hopefully amplify that in ways. That's why I wake up.
That's great. And give us one mental health tip. We're talking a lot about burnout and stress, and our latest work on anxiety at work was give us one practice that you have that helps keep you mentally fit and mentally healthy.
I'm looking at my kind of exercise corner, to be honest. I mean, that is if I'm not exercising and eating right, and kind of going back to sleeping well and those sorts of things. And as an emergency physician, I could easily throw those things away because it takes time. But if I do that, then the rest of my world kind of comes falling apart. So.
Well, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. Hey, he's the author, You're the Leader, Now What? Available at fine bookstores everywhere. Look it up at richardwinters.com. And we're brought to you by Leading with Gratitude, our book. Feel free to go there. We've got a wonderful newsletter on LinkedIn, the Gratitude Journal. We're going to be highlighting our live show there. You'll know more about Dr. Winters and his great work. I want to give a shout out to Christy Lawrence, who's our in the Question Command Center. We've got our wonderful team that comes together, Natalie Cornu, who puts all this stuff together. And most of all, we're thankful for our gratitude community. You show up every time we have a show. You have great contributions. You come in from all over the world. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. We say, look, give us 30 minutes. We'll give you a roadmap to a life of gratitude at work and at home, how it ripples through your life. It's not just a better way to lead. It's just a better way to live. So thank you so much again for your time, Dr. Winters. It's been a delight to get to know you, and I know you've done some good today, and we really appreciate your time. And with that, the show's a wrap. Hey, everybody have a great day. Thanks so much. We'll see you again next month. Cheers.
Thank you.